In this video, I'm going to tell you about the dangers of wildlife photography. This is 5 for Friday. Okay, it's Friday and this is 5 for Friday. Unfortunately, I missed the last two 5 for Fridays. I was away traveling, but I'm very excited about this one. So often people ask me about the dangers of wildlife photography, and I thought it would be great to make a video about that. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 dangers of wildlife photography, as well as for each one of those dangers, 5 ways to stay safe. So let's get started. Let's talk about the most obvious danger, at least in most people's minds, of wildlife photography, and that is getting too close to dangerous animals. Often people see my photos and they see bears or lions or some dangerous animal, and it appears that I'm quite close to the animal, and they often will ask me, how close were you? The reality is that you're often not that close. You're using a long lens, and in fact, if you're using a prime lens that doesn't allow you to zoom out, you don't want to be too close, because you then end up with a framing for the shot that is too tight. And in some cases, if the animal is very close, you won't even be able to focus at all, because all the lenses have a minimum focusing distance. So generally, you do want to be some distance away from the animals. However, sometimes you end up in a situation where the animal is a lot closer than you expect it to be. So what are the ways in which we can ensure that we're safe with regards to animals that can be dangerous to us if we're too close? One of the first things is it's really important to know your species. Obviously, if I'm photographing chipmunks, it's far less of a concern than if I'm photographing bears or lions or elephants. Understanding their behavior, understanding their body language and other language is really important. The other thing is that if you're new to a particular species or a particular area, going with someone who knows the species and or knows the area can be invaluable. Sometimes there are cases where someone has actually spent some time with the particular specific animals that you are photographing. They know that, say, this animal is very tolerant of being photographed. Another animal perhaps maybe charged them in the past when they tried to get near them. That is invaluable information. Even if you can't go with someone who has that kind of information, going with someone else is also very helpful. Even if they're not a photographer, but they're just interested perhaps in coming along and seeing the animals, it's just great to have someone else who can watch for what's happening while you have your eyes through the viewfinder photographing. Because the reality is, when you are photographing, it's very hard to keep track of everything else that's going on. When I was in Alaska recently, I was in the water sometimes with the bears. There was no one else around, no other people. In one case, I had about 10 bears in the water with me at various distances from me, and I wasn't concerned at all. I understood the situation, and I was constantly reading the situation. I had bear spray on me just in case, and I wasn't concerned, but it was definitely hard to keep track of everything that was going on and still be able to get the shots that I wanted, and having someone else there would have been helpful. Another thing is that obviously it's very important always to respect the animals, including maintaining an appropriate distance from them, and we don't want to surprise them in any way or cause them any stress. If you are there and the best way to get the shots is to be in a vehicle or to be in a hide, then you should stay in those places. Generally, you want to minimize any movement and any noise, and generally giving the animals space will make for better photos. And the behavior of the animals is something that you just want to watch for. Things like ears going back or teeth baring, those are things that are obvious signals, and you don't want those things in photos anyway. So respecting the animals is very important. It's also very important to take appropriate deterrents with you. If you're talking about animals that can be dangerous, we generally do everything that we can to communicate with the animals to ensure that they also understand that there is a respectful distance and that they don't come too close. Sometimes you have animals, especially younger animals, subadult bears, for example, that are just curious, or sometimes they want to push things a little bit, even when they're told no. They still try to come close. Having deterrents such as noisemakers, such as bear bangers, air horns, sirens, or bear spray, those things are important to have, because if you get into a situation where the animal doesn't really is not taking the signals that you're giving verbally or through body language, you may have to resort to something like that. And if you get charged, for example, by a bear, you're really going to want to have bear spray with you. And then the last thing is that you really should have some kind of last resort plan. For some people, that's having a firearm. And we're talking about a situation, obviously no one goes into a wildlife photography situation thinking that they might have to shoot an animal. We're talking about a situation where something really bad happens and someone is getting attacked by an animal and there's no other way to stop it. If you don't have a firearm, you may have some other plan in place, some other escape route or something that you're going to do to get out of there if something really bad happens. Another danger of wildlife photography is falling down. This might not seem like such an obvious one, but I've seen many cases where people fell down and they hurt themselves or they broke equipment, and I've also done it, unfortunately. So let's talk about some of the ways in which you can avoid this. The first thing is to watch where you're going. Seems pretty obvious, but when you get fixated on an animal, especially if you're following an animal, you may not be fully aware of where you're going or where you're stepping. So that's important to keep in mind. Another thing is, and again this seems obvious, but wear appropriate footwear. I've seen people wear some really silly things that don't make sense. Boots are often what is called for if you're out in the backcountry, for example, especially if you're in a cold situation in the winter. If you're in snow, you need to have appropriate winter boots. Another thing to think about, and this is sort of number 3, is along with footwear, is having traction aids. So for example, if you're wearing wading boots, if you're in the water, do you need studs on the wading boots because the rocks may be slippery in the water? Or perhaps you might use felt-soled wading boots if they're allowed and they're appropriate in the area. Another thing is if you're on ice, for example, cleats are invaluable. I've been in a situation actually where I had cleats in my backpack and I did not have them on. And guess what? I fell over. So have cleats and use them. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I've got 2 examples here. So these are some very small cleats that fit into this little package here. It's really very portable, and inside are these cleats that they're not super aggressive in terms of the spikes, right? They're very small, but they definitely make a difference. And you just put these on your boots. They're very quick to put on and take off. And then this is another example of cleats, but these ones are much more aggressive. They sort of fit in this small pouch here, and this is what they look like. They're basically much more sturdy. They go around the boot. They've got quite aggressive spikes on them, back and front, and these will really make a huge difference. So traction aids really could save your life in some cases. Another thing to think about is using walking aids such as your tripod. You often have your tripod out, and rather than, in fact, put it back on your backpack or on your back or wherever you're carrying it all the time, you could actually leave it out and use it as a walking aid. So if the legs are folded up, you can use it as a walking stick. It's invaluable if you're walking downhill, for example, or if you have the legs deployed. The tripod can be used as a walker. That can be especially effective if you're in the water, and I'll talk about that later on. And then the last thing to think about when you're walking around is the dangers of having your camera gear out. So it's easy when you're in one location and you think, okay, I just need to go over there and I've got everything in hand, my camera is out, I don't need to put it back in my backpack, I'll just walk from here to there. And in many cases that can be an easy thing, but some cases it may be a little precarious to go over there, and you may end up in a situation where you fall down. And I've seen it happen, and it happened to me too. So when I mentioned that time that I fell down on the ice, I didn't have my cleats on, well, I had my camera out. And fortunately, I didn't break the camera. Everything was still working, although I did break part of the camera. I had a remote plugged into it because I was taking shots with the remote shutter control, and the plastic flap was open. The plastic flap ripped off, and I did get a few dents in some things, but fortunately everything was still working. So where possible, try to put stuff back in your backpack so that everything is well protected when you move locations. Another danger is drowning. Yes, drowning in water. Now, this may not be an issue for you if you never get in the water, but it can be invaluable to get into the water to get certain kinds of shots, especially if the wildlife is in the water. And in fact, I love doing it. I love being in the water with animals, especially when they are in the water. Recently, when I was in Alaska, I spent a bunch of time in the water with bears that were in the water when they were fishing, and it really allowed me to get some great shots. But you really have to take a lot of precautions when you do this. So one of the first things to think about is, can you get the shots that you want without even getting in the water at all? Because even though it can be enjoyable sometimes to do it and very productive, it's a lot of hassle, right? You have to take a lot of precautions. So perhaps you can get the shots by being, say, near the water and just leaning over the water and putting your camera down fairly low to the water's surface. The other thing to think about is, if you are going to go in the water, you really need to read the water and assess the risks. Don't take any chances, especially where there's current involved or where the water is quite deep. You really need to think about things, and you really need to test things out because sometimes you can't see, the water is not very clear. You really need to, and don't rush things, go slowly and figure things out, figure out a plan. Another thing to think about is, and I mentioned this before with the tripod, is using your tripod or something else like a walking stick to help maintain stability and also to test the depth of the water as you make your way through the water. Another thing that you can do is, if you're with other people, is to link arms or otherwise assist each other so that you are maintaining as much stability as possible. The other thing is that you obviously need to have the right gear. You can't go in the water unless you have, for example, knee-high boots or hip waders or chest waders. And so it's important to obviously have the right equipment. One of the things that is if you have waders, there is a danger that if you go too deep, water will go into the waders, and then you can be in a really bad situation. So generally with chest waders, for example, you want a belt on around the waders on the outside that cinches the waders close to you, and that minimizes the possibility of water getting in there. The other thing is that you simply should not go where it's too deep, right? If I have chest waders on, which is what I normally do, I never generally go where it's deeper than my waist. So even though I could technically go up to where the water comes up to my armpits, I always leave some kind of buffer in place. The other thing is that if you are going into flowing water where there is current, you really need to think about, as I said before, assessing the situation, planning your entry and planning your exit, because sometimes they're not the same thing. Another danger of wildlife photography is getting lost. Obviously, this can happen with other activities. The thing is, with wildlife photography, sometimes we go out in remote places, and sometimes we go to places where we're not exactly sure where we're going. We know that there are animals in the area. We explore around. Sometimes we then find an animal and we track an animal, and we end up going someplace that we didn't expect to go. So there is a real possibility sometimes of getting lost. Some of the things to think about are, firstly, obviously as much as possible to let someone know where you're going, being as specific as you can possibly be, and let them know when you plan to return. Another thing to think about is, especially if you're going out where there's water and there's tides, is understanding and knowing the tidal behavior, because especially where there's, if you're in an area where there's a big difference in the tides, you can end up in a situation where you go in somewhere and you can't get out later on. You end up trapped and possibly for a very long time. Another thing is, in terms of navigating and finding our way around, it's very easy to rely on technology. We have GPS and all these fancy devices now, but things can fail. Equipment can fail, and if you're totally reliant on that equipment, you can end up in a very bad situation. So as much as possible, you should learn how to navigate without relying on such devices. And that can be as simple as just even recording landmarks as you go through an area, taking note either mentally or writing down somewhere the landmarks so that you can retrace your steps back out of there. The other thing that you should always do is you should always have basic means of survival, because sometimes the unexpected happens and you go into some place and you plan to get out of there by a certain time, but that doesn't happen, or you fall down or something. So having a first aid kit is very important. Also having ways to communicate and call for help is very important. I've heard of so many situations where people went out and they were relying on their cell phone and they did not have cell phone coverage. And in fact, it's pretty easy in some places to go not too far from home and still have no cell phone coverage. One of the things that I have that I rely on a lot is this little device here. It's called a Garmin InReach Mini. This is the smallest model in the range. There are some other different models as well. This one is really small, but needs to be paired really to get the most out of it with a cell phone through Bluetooth. And using the cell phone, then you can use the display on the phone as well as the keyboard on the phone as a means of inputting and controlling the device. So what you can do with this device is a few things. One is that it has GPS in it, so you can see your location on a map and you can plot routes and you can track a route. The other thing is that you can get very localized weather reports. And the thing then that's most important is that you can communicate with it. You can communicate with anyone on the Garmin InReach network, and this uses the Iridium satellite network. So you can generally get communication through this anywhere on the planet, as long as you can see the satellites, as long as you're outdoors and you have line of sight to the satellites. So you can communicate with anyone who is on the Garmin InReach network, but you can also text anyone on a cell phone. I use it to keep in touch with family and friends. I also use it to contact an insurance company that I have evacuation insurance with. Even in fact, as a good practice, when I go to a new location, especially a remote location, I always send them a message just to let them know where I am. But if I end up in a bad situation where I fall down and I hurt myself and I need help, or something happens, I'm in an area and war breaks out, or there's a natural disaster, I can text them through this device and call for help, and in the worst case they'll come and evacuate me out of there. Now, even if you don't have a service like that, the service that you use with the InReach device for the messaging also has an SOS capability. There's actually an SOS button on the device, so you just flip open this little flap here and press the SOS button, and that will send a message to the Garmin InReach help desk, and they will then contact local authorities based on your location to let them know that you are in need of help. The other thing to think about to help avoid getting lost is making sure that you have sources of light. So sometimes it's you go into a place and there's plenty of light, but when you're coming back, there's less light or no light at all. And sometimes we also plan to go in somewhere and get out with plenty of light, but it doesn't work out that way. So having sources of light, like having a headlamp, as well as backup sources of light is very important. I always have a headlamp with me as well as one or two other backup sources, because you never know, sometimes equipment may fail or you just forget to charge something. And even if you sort of know where you're going, if you can't see where you're going, that could be a big problem. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you about in terms of danger is getting hurt by people. This is something we perhaps might not think about, but as wildlife photographers, sometimes we go out in remote areas where we just don't see anyone, and then perhaps we come across someone and you're in the middle of nowhere with some strange person. That person might not be a nice person. The other possibility is that you do go through towns, but sometimes those towns are sketchy for some reason. So the first thing is simply try to avoid bad situations. Try to avoid suspicious or bad people where possible. That seems pretty obvious. The other thing is that you're carrying generally a lot of expensive camera gear, and this is where the potential trouble comes in. So as much as possible, do not advertise that you're carrying all of that gear. And obviously, we worry, as photographers, we worry a lot about our gear. I often have many trips planned, and I know, all my stuff is insured, but it's quite hard to replace it. And so, I worry about it a lot. I take it everywhere with me, even when I'm in some town. I generally don't leave it in a hotel room. I always take it with me. But, by having it on me, that also presents a possible risk to me. So as much as possible, I want to be incognito with my gear. The other thing to think about, of course, is that the gear is replaceable. You only have one life, so if you end up in some situation where it's either the gear or you, then by all means give up the gear. The other thing to think about is if you are tracking animals, if you're in an area where there might be hunting, that can be a real problem, and you might get hurt by accident. So try to avoid those areas by all means. If you can't avoid those areas, then by all means take precautions. Wear bright orange for visibility. Let people know that you're in the area, and so forth. I hope you enjoyed this video about some of the dangers of wildlife photography and some of the ways to stay safe. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.